So go ahead and start. All right, so good morning. I am Julia O'Leary. I'm the General Counsel at the Massachusetts Office on Disability. Today, we are going to be talking about the ADA and leaves. Um, so what we're going to cover, we're going to kind of talk about the differences between the FMLA and the ADA, and then kind of what thought process you are going to be going through when you get a request for reasonable accommodation for additional leave beyond the FMLA. And we're going to cover some of the questions that you folks have been asking me most frequently. Um, and then, we can talk some more about other questions that you might have. I also have some resources at the end, but I do think this is one where folks are going to have questions. So let's hold the questions till the end and we can have a nice question and answer session then. We do have ASL interpreters today. Thank you to the interpreters for being with us and helping us. And we also have a CART captioner. So if you want to avail yourself of the CART captioning, that is available if you click the little three dots more in your Zoom menu. You can turn on that captioning. Just for visual description, I am a mid-30s white woman with a dark blonde ponytail wearing a black jacket. All right, so I have been getting a lot of questions about the intersection between the ADA and the FMLA. And this is a pretty confusing and convoluted area. So I think you're not alone if this sort of distinction between ADA leave and FMLA leave feels a little overwhelming, confusing to you to navigate. So let's start by kind of going over the differences between the two acts. So under the ADA, leave might be an appropriate, reasonable accommodation if it enables an employee to return to work following the leave period. And so what that means from sort of a practical perspective is that if we as the employer have policies around leave in place, we might need to modify those policies that limit the allowed duration of leave. So, traditionally, we allow employees to take FMLA, PFML. Some union contracts allow for catastrophic leave, other types of leave. We have EILB. When those types of leave have been exhausted, you might need to modify your leave policy to allow someone to take additional leave if it's necessary for them to be able to return to work. We're going to talk about kind of the particulars of that analysis a little bit later in this presentation. But that's sort of the general concept that we're working under, that this could be a reasonable accommodation if it's going to allow the employee to come back to work. Oftentimes, leaves of limited duration will be reasonable when you're doing that reasonableness analysis of the accommodation request. And it's important to it's important that the ADA's sort of non-retaliation, non-discrimination clause comes in here. You can't penalize an employee for taking leave as a reasonable accommodation. So, for example, if you have sort of quotas that employees are expected to meet during the year, you can't penalize them or give them a negative performance rating because they didn't meet that quota. On the other hand, the FMLA, so sort of the idea of the ADA is that you're giving someone leave in order to allow them to come back to work because they need that additional leave in order to come back and perform the essential functions of their job. FMLA leave comes from a really different angle. The purpose of the FMLA is job protection. And so it is a vehicle that protects an employee's job when they're taking leave for a serious health condition that prevents them from working. So when you're thinking about the ADA, the goal is to get the person able to work, able to perform the essential functions of their job, whereas the FMLA protects your job when you are unable to work. So it's sort of two different angles, and that can be a little bit confusing. Um, you know, under the FMLA, the employer needs to return the employee to the same or comparable position at the end of that leave. So, as I said, the FMLA is really about job protection, whereas the ADA is really about access and prohibition against discrimination. So, I think the two different end goals of these acts is what can make it a little confusing for us as the employer to navigate how to apply them, when to apply them. But keeping in mind that these are two separate, sort of separate acts with separate goals can be really helpful for teasing those differences apart. So under the ADA, the leave that someone is granted does not need to be paid if paid leave isn't available to all employees in that circumstance. But if someone has accrued leave, then you would want to allow them to use that accrued leave and then use unpaid leave as more leave is needed. And that's pretty similar to how we handle FMLA here at the Commonwealth. You know, you get to use your accrued leave first, and then you can have additional unpaid leave if you run out of that accrued time. On the other hand, PFML is a vehicle now that employees can use to sort of receive full pay without, well, not full pay, but receive pay with the top off while they're out without having to use those accruals. And that for purposes of this training, I'm going to use kind of PFML and FMLA interchangeably, because we're not so much talking about the payment mechanism of PFML, but more the job protection after the leave. So as a general matter, FMLA's definition of serious health condition is broader than the ADA's definition of disability. A serious health condition is some kind of illness, injury, impairment that involves inpatient care or continuing treatment. A disability, on the other hand, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So for FMLA, it needs to be a serious health condition, but you don't have that requirement that it substantially limit a major life activity. That said, after 2008, when the ADA Amendments Act was passed, that definition of disability has broadened. And so that overlap between FMLA and ADA covered conditions has grown. If you are working with your legal department on a matter that sort of is involving the definition of serious health condition versus disability, I would just urge your legal department to be careful about using case law that predates 2008 and the ADA Amendments Act, because that might give them the impression that there is less overlap than there has been since then. So as a general matter, FMLA has sort of a broader protection for the types of health conditions, but the overlap between the ADA and FMLA has grown. Under FMLA, PFML, you get 12 weeks for your serious health condition. Under the ADA, there is no limit to the leave that you can request, but there has to be some limit. And so the EEOC has said that an indefinite leave is very likely to be an undue burden on the employer. And courts, specifically the 10th Circuit and 8th Circuit, have found that a 6-month leave was unreasonable as a matter of law. And so probably the limit under the ADA is 6 months, but it's not clearly spelled out in the act or in the regulation. And the limit of the leave, just to not skip over this, the limit of the leave has to be reasonable. And so what might be reasonable in one circumstance for one employer, one employee, might not be reasonable in another situation. So other things that you want to think about as you're thinking about the ADA and FMLA and how they're intersecting are what kind of accommodations might be necessary when an employee returns from leave, either from FMLA leave or from ADA leave. And it's also important, if you're working under the ADA, that you're careful about choosing leave over other accommodations that allow an employee to keep working. The EEOC has made pretty clear that leave should be an accommodation of last resort, that the goal of the Americans with Disabilities Act is to keep folks working so long as they're able to fulfill their essential job functions. And so while sometimes leave might be the only way to keep someone in their job so that they can eventually resume those essential job functions, the goal of the act is to keep the employee working. And so you should be choosing accommodations that will be effective at addressing the employee's needs while keeping them at work. And the employer really can't force an employee to take leave if another accommodation will be effective. I mean, we'll talk about kind of the flip of that because I think that's something that we see more frequently here as the employer. But I want to kind of delve into the specifics of how are you as an ADA coordinator going to be handling requests for accommodation for leave beyond FMLA or other types of leave programs that we have in the Commonwealth, PFML, catastrophic leave, PILB. So when you get a request for leave as a reasonable accommodation, you need specific information. You need to understand the specific reasons that the employee needs to leave. You need to understand what that leave is going to look like. Is it going to be consecutive leave? Is it going to be intermittent leave? And you also need to know when the leave will end. I have a little asterisk there because that's really important. And the case law has made really clear, and the EEOC guidance has also made really clear that requests for indefinite leave aren't reasonable, and there needs to be a reasonable end date to that leave that shows that the employee is going to be able to resume performing the essential functions of their job, as is the goal of the Act. So when is a request for leave under the ADA reasonable? So, as I've been kind of hammering here, the leave must have an end date. It cannot be indefinite. And the employee must be able to resume their essential job functions with or without reasonable accommodation in the near future. And so, as I said earlier, the 8th and the 10th circuits have said that a 6-month or greater leave is not the near future and is per se unreasonable. Now, the First Circuit, which is our circuit, has not said that I've found. And so I don't know that we can cling to that too tightly here. But I think as a practical matter, if you're thinking about it, 6 months of leave after someone has already exhausted their other leave programs that are available to them is really inching towards um, that unreasonable territory where, you know, the employer has a valid need to have the employee in the workplace. And the courts have been very consistent that attendance is an essential job function, working is an essential job function. And so, sort of extended, very long term leaves are unlikely to be reasonable. When you're approving these requests for leave, it's really important, as I said before, that there isn't another accommodation that will allow the employee to continue working. That leave really needs to be a last resort. It's really important that in your approval letter, if you're approving a leave request, that you are very specific about the duration of the leave. And I would talk to the employee and include in that letter as well, sort of what the procedures might be if that leave end date is approaching and they are unable to resume the essential functions of their job. Maybe that means that they need to request another leave. You're going to have to figure out if that's going to be reasonable. Um, Maybe you're going to talk about, some other options if they're not able to resume work at the end of that leave. You're also going to want to talk about what accommodations the employee might need when they return from leave and set expectations about how and when they're going to connect with you to start that conversation about what other accommodations they might need upon their return. Maybe they can do some of the essential functions of their job without accommodation, but they need maybe additional time to complete other essential functions. Maybe they need some equipment in the workplace to help them perform their essential job functions. Um, but you're going to want to start that conversation before, you know, the day before they're going to be back in the office. So just from a practical perspective, it probably makes sense that you'll check in 20 business days before their expected return date. That is, if it's a longer leave, so that you can get that conversation in the standard sort of SLA that we have to complete reasonable accommodation requests in 20 days. You should let them use any accruals, as I said before, prior to taking unpaid leave if they're going to be taking an ADA leave. Now, when you're denying requests for leave under the ADA, it's important that you are listing sort of the specific reasons why the leave that they have requested will cause an undue hardship to the employer. It might be that you can't find a temporary replacement because of the nature of the job, if they're in a highly specialized position. So, if they're highly skilled, high level engineer, it's going to be really hard to find a temp for that to cover that position. Whereas it might be easier to find a temp to cover an administrative assistant who needs to be out on leave, or a teller who needs to be out on leave. Sometimes the frequency, the length, or the unpredictability of the leave is going to pose an undue hardship. So this is where ADA leave is really different from FMLA. Under the FMLA, you can't really negotiate the terms of that leave, but under the ADA, you certainly do have the right to. And sometimes an intermittent leave is going to be really burdensome for the employer if there isn't a good way to predict when someone's going to need to take that intermittent leave, if you need to worry about coverage, if you need to worry about deadlines. So you do have the flexibility in ADA world to negotiate sort of how that leave is taken in a way that is going to serve your business interests. So if the frequency, the length, the unpredictability of the leave is posing an undue hardship on the business, that is a reason to deny leave. It's also a reason to sort of negotiate the terms of it. Sometimes also timing can pose an undue hardship. So I was at a training recently where the trainer talked about a situation where an employee um, was like in sort of he was like an event support person, and the busy season for the employer was October, and the employee was having pretty severe anxiety, other mental health issues, and so he needed to go for some inpatient treatment. And what he worked out with the employer was that he would wait until after the busy season of October and take the leave in November so that his leave wouldn't have the same impact on the employer's business that they needed to get done. So in the state context, you might, you know, you might say that somebody who needs to take leave, who works in the finance department, maybe it won't be appropriate for them to take leave during the month of June, which is a really busy season where you're closing out the fiscal year. Other agencies have other busy seasons where it might just not be feasible for someone to be out for that period of time. And maybe there's another time period that they could take their leave instead. So you can have that kind of conversation in the interactive process under the ADA that you can't have under FMLA. So of course, this is happening when the other leave types, including FMLA, have already been exhausted. But once that, FMLA, other types of leave have been exhausted and you're working under the ADA, you can have that discussion as you're going through the interactive process. So one question that I get really frequently is the employee is asking for leave as a reasonable accommodation, but they haven't exhausted their FMLA or other types of leave. And so the question that I get is, do I need to treat this as a reasonable accommodation, or can I have them exhaust those other types of leave first? And the EEOC has been very clear that if there are other leave programs available, you may provide leave under those programs first. So you do not have to provide leave as a reasonable accommodation and like not have it count towards the leave time under FMLA or PFML. You can say you need to exhaust those programs first. And if you need additional leave beyond that, come back to me for a reasonable accommodation. The other question that I get a lot is, do I have to provide leave as a reasonable accommodation? And because it's the ADA, you never have to do anything. Everything is always in shades of gray, right? So you need to engage in the interactive process to determine the best way to meet both the employee and the employer's needs. That might be leave, that might be a different accommodation. And as I've said a few times, if there's another accommodation that would be effective at allowing the person to perform their essential job functions, the goal of the ADA is to keep the person working. And so you should choose accommodations that allow the person to work over leave if possible. And then the other question that I get a lot is, does that leave under the ADA need to be paid leave? It doesn't need to be paid if paid leave isn't available to all employees. But as I've said a couple of times, you need to let them use accrued leave. So you do not have to grant paid leave as a reasonable accommodation. In fact, that probably wouldn't be reasonable. You would let them use their accruals and then use unpaid time. So I have a couple of resources for you. This EEOC guidance on employer provided leave and the ADA is very helpful. So I would definitely recommend checking that one out. I have also got our employment guidance page linked, and a page from the National ADA Center on leave under the ADA and FMLA. But I really want to allow enough time for you guys to ask questions. So I will open it up. I know you guys have questions because you've asked me questions before. So please don't be shy. And we can stop recording if that will make you more free with your question. I'll give you a minute. Bill, why don't you turn off the recording and we can then have people ask their questions.
Not a problem. I'm stopping it now.
Thank you.